Praise the Lord. This uh, teaching segment is on existential therapy from chapter number 7 of 10. Um, I guess, first of all, I want to give you a little roadmap of where we're headed in this session here. We want to answer a question: what is existential therapy? Of course, I'm going to start with a little introduction, maybe define some terms, answer some questions. Um, we'll talk about some important people having to do with existential therapy. We'll talk about some basic principles that give a foundation to this therapy. Um, the therapeutic process, we'll cover that a little bit. We'll get into, after that, some strengths and weaknesses of this therapy. And then finally, we'll wrap uh, this session up with a biblical perspective of existential therapy. So, first of all, um, in digging into this, there were some terms and some words that I had to look up and just kind of make sure I knew what they meant. And so, I want to define some terms here and give a little introduction here. So, what is existential therapy? Um, in reading through this chapter, I found that existential therapy is not really a therapy. It's more it's more of a therapy based on a philosophy, and existentialism is a philosophical theory or approach that emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent. In my biblical training, a lot of times you hear the term free moral agent. That kind of goes along with that same understanding there. And so basically what that means is you or the individual determines their own development through what they choose, through their own acts of the will. This doesn't disregard or negate or minimize in any way that every individual is going to have circumstances, challenges that are unique to them that they'll have to deal with. But again, they still have the freedom and the ability to choose how they handle life's circumstances as they come into their life. um, when it comes to existential therapy, it tends to focus on the therapeutic relationship and an authentic encounter between the therapist and the individual more than, uh, let's say, techniques of therapy. The views of existential therapists cover a wide range. They range in views from optimistic to pessimistic and even to nihilistic. And that's another word that I had to look up to see what it meant. Um, and they're even in this segment, in this therapy, there are religious people and non religious people. So, of course, optimistic, we know an optimistic person is one that's hopeful for the future, uh, confident that things are going to turn out all right. Pessimistic people are those that tend to see the worst things. They're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, so to speak, thinking the worst is going to happen. Nihilistic people are those that reject all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is basically meaningless. It's interesting that the views of theological philosophers tend to be more optimistic, and the views of existential writers most times are pessimistic, even nihilistic. I want to move on now, quickly cover some important people that have to do with existential therapy. Quickly, I want to mention uh, some people who influenced the originators and important figures in existential therapy. Certainly, there was Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Jean Paul Sartre, and Martin Buber. These were philosophers and people who, thinkers that influenced the key players that I'm going to mention. There are six key players or originators, important people when it comes to existential therapy. First of all, there was Ludwig Binswanger, and he was a Swiss psychiatrist who became an existential analyst. And excuse me if I butcher some of these names. There was Medard Boss, another Swiss psychiatrist, originally trained as a psychoanalyst and even was analyzed by Freud, it was said. Then there was Viktor Frankl, and he was the founder of one of the therapies that come out of existential therapy. He was the founder of logotherapy. Now, logotherapy is different than Lego therapy. Lego therapy is when your kids leave Legos outside of your bedroom door and you walk out in your bare feet and immediately go into a dance and try to find your way through the maze of Legos scattered on the floor. Logotherapy is an existential therapy that literally means therapy through meaning, focusing on an individual's will for meaning or search for meaning in their life as one of the most fundamental of human motivations. Then there was Rollo May. He is considered the best known contemporary author and advocate of existential therapy. And the final two, James Bugental, and he has developed an approach to existential therapy that focuses on the immediate here and now experiences during the therapy session itself. And finally, Irvin Yalom. He is another key figure in um, existential therapy and has written what Tan calls the most systematic and comprehensive approach to existential therapy to date in the text that he wrote, Existential Therapy. I want to talk to you about the major theoretical ideas of existential therapy. There are three main points I want to bring to your attention. Number one is the perspective on human nature. Now, I've already mentioned the diverse nature of existential therapists, so it only stands to reason that there is going to be some different perspectives on human nature. Some have a very positive and hopeful outlook on life, and others have a more negative approach. They look at life as meaningless. However, the therapist views life and human nature, they do emphasize the freedom that every person has to choose their own values and meaning in life. Existential therapy does not have a fixed view when it comes to human nature. That means that each person is constantly becoming whoever he or she chooses to become. Present awareness is valued in choosing what meaning and values he or she may want to have in life. Because of this, it leads to the experience of existential anxiety. Number two, I want to cover personality theory. Existential therapists emphasize existence first without any fixed or essential personality traits. This existence is often referred to as being in the world. There are three levels of the world to which each person relates as he or she exists in the world. And these three levels are denoted by three different German words. They are Umwelt, My Welt, and I believe Eigenwelt. So umwelt is the physical and biological dimensions of the world, or being in nature. My welt is the social world of people, or being with others. Eigenwelt is a person's own inner world of experiences, or being for oneself. Every human being chooses how they will relate to these three levels. The existential philosophy challenges one to live in a transparent or open way, or authentic way. However, this level of openness sometimes leads to what we already talked about, existential anxiety. Some of the sources of such anxiety come from an awareness of death, or the need to act, meaninglessness, isolation. These things highlight our finiteness as human beings. In existential therapy, you try to bring a person to a place where they embrace these things and make the right choices to live a better life. Don't get hung up on death and choose not to live your life at all, but choose to embrace that it's going to happen to everybody and live a full life. Now, recently, a fourth way of being in the world was defined, and that is Uberwelt. Uberwelt includes one's spiritual beliefs and refers to the way that one wants to be in the world. Number three, the third thing I want to talk to you about is development of psychopathology. If an individual avoids existential anxiety and living authentically, this can lead to psychological problems and is really lying to oneself. This in turn can lead to other psychopathological behaviors, such as obsessive compulsive checking behaviors. Psychopathology is usually associated with an overemphasis on one level of being in the world while ignoring other levels in an imbalanced way. And lying can occur in any of the three levels of being: lying in nature, lying to others, or lying for oneself. Let's cover now the therapeutic process and relationship. The most fundamental goal of existential therapy is to get a person to be open and honest, or authentic. With this in mind, the therapeutic relationship must be authentic. This is a key method in existential therapy. One cannot ask the client to be authentic if the therapist is not also authentic. So, this authentic relationship is very important. In existential therapy, the focus is more upon existential issues rather than the problems or problem solving. The issues we're referring to here, we've mentioned before: living and dying, freedom, responsibility and choice, isolation and loving, meaning and meaninglessness. And so let's go back through and kind of cover these issues. First of all, there's living and dying. A central existential issue that every individual must face is the reality of death. It's a fact that we see in Scripture that we'll all die someday. The existential therapist will help the client facing the issue of death to choose, nonetheless, to embrace living life as authentically as possible while realistically accepting mortality and grieving over significant losses. Next, there's freedom, responsibility, and choice. Existential therapists believe that their clients have the freedom to choose to live as authentically as possible despite their past histories, which may include a lot of pain, trauma, or abuse. They help their clients focus not on the past, but on the freedom they have to choose a better future. If the client can see they have a choice, they may come to a place where they can discover meaning in life. Existential therapists also emphasize the importance of clients taking responsibility for their choices and actions instead of blaming others. Excuse me. Clients take full responsibility in this process of choice involving their own wishing, willing, and deciding. The existential therapist, therefore, uses emphatic listening, authentic dialogue with gentle but firm confrontation when necessary, support, encouragement, and self disclosure or authentic sharing of the therapist's own experiencing of the client during a session to help the client deal with the core existential issues of freedom, responsibility, and choice. And then, thirdly, the third issue or area is isolation and loving. Isolation or aloneness is a key area that is addressed and discussed in existential therapy. The provision of a deeply caring relationship based on therapeutic love by the existential therapist can help the client to deal more authentically with his or her sense of isolation. This may help the client to have courage to change and reach out to others in order to develop relationships. One word of caution here in this particular area is to not allow the client to be so over dependent on the therapeutic session or therapeutic love so as to not develop and seek relationships outside of the therapy. Finally, there's the issue or area of meaning and meaninglessness. It was Frankl that developed logotherapy. We talked about logotherapy a little bit before. It was Frankl that developed logotherapy as a specific approach to existential therapy that focuses on meaning as the fundamental existential issue of every individual. The four specific techniques often used in logotherapy are Socratic dialogue, then there is paradoxical intention, and dereflection is number three, and then fourth, finally, attitude modification. Now, what in the world do those things mean? We're going to talk about those real quick. So, first of all, Socratic dialogue. This involves discussing with the client several issues in their lives to help them discover their strengths and search for meaning in their lives using questions that the therapist asks and poses that help clarify the client's basic assumptions and beliefs so that their erroneous notions can be corrected and they can be brought to a better understanding of the issues. Secondly, is paradoxical intention. This is a therapeutic technique that requires clients to exaggerate their symptoms, or if you can believe this, do more of what they fear. This process usually helps the client to become less self focused and to see more clearly the irony and humor of the situation he or she fears, often resulting in a reduction in fear or anxiety of that particular issue, whatever they're struggling with at the time. Thirdly, there is dereflection. Now, this is a technique that involves encouraging clients to turn away from focusing on their own problems and instead to direct their attention or awareness to something else that is more pleasant, more positive, or more meaningful. Such dereflection can help clients to put things in better perspective or to be less absorbed with their own problems and to enjoy other more meaningful and positive experiences in their lives. And then finally, the fourth area of logotherapy. All these are uh, techniques in logotherapy. The fourth is attitude modification. This involves changing the client's thinking about something. If the therapist can change the way a client views a negative thing, then perhaps a more positive thing can emerge. So, existential therapy is most helpful to clients who are facing developmental crisis, experiencing grief over losses, uh, encountering death, and having to make important decisions. It is also particularly appropriate for clients who are experiencing emptiness and alienation in their lives and thus are looking for a more meaningful existence, including clients who are struggling with a lack of a sense of identity. Hey, we're going to take a moment now and examine some of existential therapy's strengths and weaknesses. First, we'll cover the strengths, then the weaknesses. So, as far as the strengths go, number one, it focuses on the person with a unique existential perspective. It emphasizes the individual's self awareness, the individual's freedom to choose, and uh, the individual's responsibility to live an authentic life with meaning. Number two, it deals directly with core human issues such as death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, instead of avoiding them. So it helps you kind of bring them to the front. Number three, it views the therapeutic relationship as the central healing factor in therapy for a client. It emphasizes genuine love and caring for the client instead of just being kind of mechanical. Number four, the fourth strength of existential therapy is it views the person of the therapist as crucial in effective therapy. This kind of goes along with number three, but it's a little bit different. The therapist shows themselves as a wounded healer on the same road to recovery. And then number five, it is helpful and appropriate for clients who are facing developmental crisis or important kind of crossroad decisions in life. So we want to now talk about the weaknesses real quick. The weaknesses, number one, its major theoretical concepts have been criticized as being vague or unclear, even confusing at times. What does authenticity mean? How do you define that? What does living in the here and now mean? How do you define taking responsibility for oneself? These could mean different things, so how do you define those? Another weakness, number two, in order to be authentic or honest, the therapist may have to be more confrontational than is helpful. This can potentially be harmful. Number three, in the weaknesses, a strength is it focuses on the issues, and a weakness is it focuses on the issues. Some clients do not want to focus on the issues and instead want to focus only on symptom alleviation. Some clients really just don't want to talk about the real issues, they just want to feel better. Number four, existential therapy does not emphasize clear therapeutic techniques, structure, or process. It's more, as we've already said back in the beginning, I believe, it's more of a philosophy or a way of thinking. And as such, it's harder to discern empirical data or evaluate effectiveness at times. Number five, in weaknesses, existential therapies focus on the client's ability and freedom to choose may not give sufficient attention to biological factors or sociocultural factors in the development of certain disorders. And then number 6, finally, existential therapy is not usually brief and structured, and so medical insurance may resist paying for this kind of therapy. Logotherapy that we talked about may be the exception to this weakness. I want to wrap up this presentation in the last few moments here talking about a biblical perspective. I think it's important that we look at the biblical perspective in everything we do. Existential therapy has a deep respect for the person in the human capacity for freely and responsibly choosing to live an authentic life with meaning. It deals with some of the same issues that the Bible deals with. So it could be said that existential therapy is the therapeutic approach that most closely mirrors biblical concerns or basic issues of the Christian faith. The questions that existential therapy asks are right on target biblically, but the answers that existential therapy provides are often not on target and simply unbiblical and wrong. In existential therapy, the client is encouraged to be authentic and real in answering questions. Any authentic, self originating answer will do. However, from a biblical perspective, such relativism and self autonomy in an individual's becoming an authentic person is misplaced because the Bible's view is that human beings are meant to center their lives in objective values that are real because God exists and is the source of such eternal objective values. So, subjective, self chosen, arbitrary values may conflict with biblical values and God's will, which ultimately focuses on our spiritual formation and growth into deeper Christ likeness in our being or character as well as our lifestyle. Existential therapy can become nihilistic if it overemphasizes the wrong things, and this leads to the therapy being spiritually hopeless without the gospel of Jesus Christ. Existential, excuse me, the existential emphasis on experience rather than dogma is also problematic from a biblical perspective that emphasizes the importance and need for objective truth and values, especially as revealed in Scripture as inspired revelation from God. A Christian approach to existential therapy will therefore deeply and authentically deal with anxiety, emptiness, or meaningless. It will deal with isolation as well as deal with sin and despair. It will do so in spiritually meaningful and transforming ways that help ground an individual in God as the ultimate and true ground of being. That is, spirit, small s, grounded in spirit, capital S, or self, small s, grounded in self, capital S. A Christian approach to existential therapy will be careful to direct clients ultimately to God so they can become a self grounded in Him or a spirit grounded in Him and not just in the autonomous self of the individual. Dependence on God is crucial for healing and wholeness as well as holiness in Christ. The Bible, as God's inspired revelation, provides ultimate and objectively true answers centered in Jesus Christ and the gospel.